Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Mark, thank you, and welcome to Londonderry, a city that sits right next to the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. The border may have been a sideshow during the Brexit referendum campaign, but it has now become the main feature. The government seems paralysed by it, fighting over how to escape the grand Brexit dilemma. Do we have a modest physical border here, which the government has said it will not countenance, or do we opt for a soft Brexit inside a customs union, which the government has said it won't countenance? Well, we're going to be taking a pretty comprehensive look at the issue throughout the week on Newsnight. And to start us off tonight, we're here in the Guildhall in Derry with politicians and members of the public and commentators. We're less than 3 miles from the border, and we've come here because the city has long had to live with the division that the border issue threatens to accentuate. The city is beautifully located on the banks of the River Foyle, but its very name, Derry/Londonderry, can be divisive. If only it were called, say, Foyleside, like the local shopping centre, a neutral formulation of fewer than 6 syllables. The city at one time had its own internal border. The peace wall separated the communities. There's only a little of it left now, and it's something of a tourist attraction, one measure of how far things have come. For some, though, the city is now synonymous with the hugely popular Channel 4 sitcom, Derry Girls.
You can't marry an orange man, Michelle. It's a pity, because I think there's something really sexy about the fact that they hate us so much.
Well, the fact of the comedy is yet another reminder of how much has changed in the city of Bloody Sunday. But now, though, Ireland finds itself sitting on the front line of that endlessly long-running battle between soft and hard variants of Brexit. Northern Ireland's population is smaller than West Yorkshire, yet it is here that the argument, almost the entire argument, is being fought. An argument that involves 3 borders, in fact. Northern Ireland and the Republic, Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and Great Britain and the Republic. This is the awkward one. The famous Irish border. This bridge marks the divide between the North and the Republic, and you can see the problem. It's open, too open to now obstruct. And there's an awful lot of it, 300 miles, over 200 crossing points.
I remember when there was barriers across here.
Barriers across here?
Yeah.
You can remember that?
Okay, surely. Yeah.
So this road was shut?
This road was closed altogether.
I don't think there's any call for a border. If they put a border in, they'll blow her up this time again.
Do you think they will? Because the people have been saying that, you know.
All will, surely.
It's not just an idle threat.
No, they're sick of them.
Border country, near the Northern Irish town of Warren Point. But this is no longer a border in the usual sense. Normally, borders make nations. Control of a border equals control of your taxes and regulations. One can find relics of borders past here. The border says who can come in, what can come in, and at what price. Take back control could be said to mean have a border. Here, that's all gone. There's no control here. So the challenge is quite simple. A lot of people voted for Brexit so that the UK could go its own way and do its own thing, which requires a strong border. And yet at the same time, whether it's in Dover or Hull or here, we want as little border as possible. Really hard to reconcile those two desires. But the north-south land border is not the only reason Ireland has for wanting Britain to avoid imposing border controls. There's a second border to think about, one that dominates Ireland's trade flows. This is the port in Dublin. Basically, Brexit is really annoying for Ireland. At the moment, the country is in the EU Single Market and Customs Union, a zone that extends continuously all the way over there to Eastern Europe. They refer to Britain here as the land bridge to the rest of Europe. Now imagine a really hard Brexit. Well then, to get things from here to Europe, they have to go through customs to get into the UK, and then through customs again to get back into the single market from which they started. Instead of being a land bridge, Britain becomes an obstructive piece of rock, getting in between Ireland and the market it increasingly feels is home.
We're already seeing major shipping lines deploying brand new capacity on direct routes from Dublin to continental Europe.
Here's how Ireland is preparing, commissioning new ships, a Brexit buster like this that'll go to mainland Europe direct.
People are simply going to say, not worth it, just not worthwhile, and it'll go on to the longer and slower but more dependable direct routes to continental Europe.
Ireland is creating options for itself, but it would undoubtedly prefer not to have to do so. Brexiteers fear Ireland's using the fraught issue of the land border to thwart harder versions of Brexit altogether.
And we'd be very, very happy if the monies we invest in the physical border controls turns out to be a wasted investment, but we have to make that investment now anyway.
I ask if there's a bit of bluff here, an attempt to scare Britain towards a softer Brexit.
I wouldn't comment on the politics. It's an extraordinarily complex challenge that our politicians in Ireland and our civil servants are having to cope with.
The EU have a backstop plan for the border. It won't help the port because it puts a border in the Irish Sea between Britain and Ireland north and south, which takes us to the third border in this relationship. Away from the land border, up near Larne in the top right of Northern Ireland, you can see Britain, the Mull of Kintyre. The historic connection is alive and well. There's even talk of building a bridge. Do you feel closer to Scotland?
We're Ulster Scots anyway, so we are.
You consider yourself?
Oh, aye, Ulster Scot.
And do you think they'll ever build a bridge there? It doesn't look that far away from here.
No chance. Look at it, 20 miles.
And up here, the problem of the border is one for others to solve. Somehow, anyhow. Do you think they can get away with number plate readers or cameras? Do you think they can get away with that?
Unnecessary expense.
I mean, we've just been down there. Do you accept the idea it's going to be hard to have some physical border there, some infrastructure at the border?
Virtually impossible now. And I don't think it'll be acceptable to anybody.
People are saying it's going to stop Brexit or get in the way of Brexit.
Well, I don't see how Brexit should be on the go now. It should be ready to go now and get on with it and then see what happens. Get on with it first and then we'll see what happens. But the people voted and you can't change it.
So let's take a minute to take stock of the potential outcomes here. And essentially, we're trapped between a fundamental choice between the hard and soft versions of Brexit. The Brexiteers' dream and the Brexiteers' nightmare. The dream is a hard Brexit, but it would involve a border. Not a border like the past, but probably some physical infrastructure, a camera. The Brexiteers' nightmare, the soft Brexit, well, that means Britain inside the customs union. It means Britain inside the single market, or at least as far as goods are concerned. No border, but Brexit in name only. It's not an easy problem to resolve. The public tend to big views of the issue rather than detailed ones, and yet the details will have a big effect on the kind of Brexit we adopt. Now, let's be clear, there's not going to be a people border under any scenario, no passport control. It's all about goods and trade, and whether there's a way to avoid the binary choice between a physical border, even a subtle one, or a soft Brexit. One potential outcome is to have a hard Brexit, but just to allow smuggling. Don't think the EU will tolerate that. Another thought is that maybe technology can make the subtle physical border so subtle as to be invisible. But it just doesn't exist, or if it does, no one's found it yet. And a third option is to have less border, but more internal controls. You could track trucks away from the border, which is actually part of the government's idea of a so-called customs partnership, but it's complex and untried. So a bunch of ideas. Let's have a think about those with Martina Anderson, Sinn Fein MEP and the party's Brexit coordinator, and Nelson McCausland of the DUP. He was member of the Stormont Assembly here until last year. I know there are other parties in Northern Ireland. Politics is never simple, but apologies for not having time to hear from them all. We will, though, hear from members of the public with us here, each with a reason for wanting to express a view on the border issue. We'll introduce them as we go along. Nelson McCausland, I wonder if I can just ask you, you voted leave. Did you know when you voted leave what a nuisance the whole issue of Northern Ireland was going to be to the Brexit project, as the people in Britain might see it?
Well, I think the issue has been inflated by quite a number of people, mainly Remainers, in order to effectively frustrate Brexit.
So what is your solution, your preferred solution, to what is called the Irish border problem?
Well, first of all, you have to be clear as to what the problem or the issue is. And there is, I think, good evidence that we can look at elsewhere of how it might be approached. So, for example, you can look at the arrangements in regard to the EU and Switzerland. You can look at the.
Hang on.
Sorry, just
okay.
Just make a point.
So is that your suggestion?
No, it's not.
Whoa. Okay, so why do you mention it then?
I'm mentioning it because it is an indication of the way in which you might consider approaching it. You also can look at the arrangements between Norway and Sweden. But the other thing that needs to be looked at very carefully is the nature of the trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I think you have a small number of companies.
I want to just pin you down, because you've given two models, both of which have borders, manned borders often, not always, but often, and on major roads, manned borders, and they have physical infrastructure. The Swiss border, you will have seen on some motorways, has blooming great stations where people stop. They sometimes have queues of trucks. Now, is that your suggestion for what should happen to what is called the Irish border?
Well, you've picked there on the initial example I gave of Switzerland.
Okay, well, you gave it, I'm sorry.
I'm saying that those are examples of the sort of thing that might be done.
Well, let's have one that's not the sort, but it's the actual thing that might be done, because people keep offering these examples that sound seductive.
Yes.
You examine them, and they involve blooming great borders.
And then I said also you could look at the example
okay,
between Norway and Sweden.
Okay, so now tell us your solution, which is one without a border.
I will if you'll
Okay, go on then, give it to us.
The example of Norway and Sweden is not quite the same as Switzerland.
No.
And if you take Norway and Sweden and then look at an enhanced model of that, but also look at the fact that much of the trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic, a very large percentage of it is actually limited to a small number of companies. So you could look, for example, at having a trusted trader arrangement. You could also consider the fact that I think about half of the companies that deal in trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic are actually micro businesses. So and also you need partnership.
I want to put that to Martina. And Martina, that is, we've got there, the Brexit idea for the border. And what is unreasonable about that?
Well, before I answer that question, on behalf of Sinn Féin, I want to send our deepest condolences to the Palestinian people in the slaughter that took place there today, and we've seen some of the images on your screen. Okay. I think after just listening to Nelson, basically what he's doing, if you don't mind me saying so, is pardon what the British government has been saying for over a year now, which has been rejected by the EU and by committees in the House of Commons. And basically, it doesn't deal with a fact that the British government is a co-guarantor of a Good Friday Agreement, an international agreement that is lodged at the United Nations. The
British government have said there won't be physical infrastructure, by the way. They've said they've actually already rejected the suggestion.
Yeah,
a different question.
So because the British government is a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, in the joint report that was agreed by the EU and the British government in December of this year, The British government had guaranteed that there would be no physical infrastructure, no
And
checks
is that the end of the
or no
matter? And
controls.
does that mean not even a number plate reader discreetly put 500 metres from the border? So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
No physical infrastructure, no checks
No,
or no
at
controls.
the border, but inside, or
You see, well, there was actually a proposal put forward by the British government. It would agree to one of three options. One, there would be a solution. Secondly, they would bring about a precise solution for here, and they haven't produced one credible document. And they said if they don't do A or B, let me finish, they then said that there would be the backstop, of which the British government agreed to in December of this year.
I'm going to talk about the backstop.
They did agree in December of this year.
If you allow me just to make the point. The fact that Martina has highlighted there is very clear, that you need partnership between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom as a whole, and the Dublin government and the EU. There needs to be a partnership approach. What we've faced up to now is a case of Dublin and Brussels saying no to everything.
No, that's nonsense.
Well,
That
it's
is
not nonsense, just
patent
fact.
nonsense.
Sorry, I just wanted, Martin, I want to
Absolute
ask you a very specific question. Forget the British border. If the EU puts some physical infrastructure inside the Republic of Ireland, discrete 500 metres from the border, this is EU equipment, not Crown equipment, would that, in your opinion, be damaged? Or is it just the British equipment on the British side that would be damaged?
Brexit is incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement. So what you need to
So are you saying
understand...
that EU equipment would be damaged if it was put there? I just want to be clear about the...
Absolutely. There should be no border on the island of Ireland. No hard border on the island of Ireland.
Let me go to the panel. Rob, I'm going to go... I want to bring in our members of the public. And we have three of you, I think, voted... Actually, it was the three men who voted leave, and the three women, although not voting, in fact, had, I think, supporters of Remain. I wonder, who should we start with? Robert, you're a farmer, and you do travel across the border quite a bit, do you? Or do you use the current Irish border? And how you voted Remain. How worried are you by the idea that there might be any kind of physical infrastructure?
I didn't vote Remain, I voted
I mean leave. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Voted leave, yeah. How worried are you by that border?
I'm not overly worried at the moment because we don't know what to be worried about. I mean, there's basically been no proposals coming through. We're in a state of flux, and I think that's really quite dangerous for businesses, for myself, farming right on the border. I trade across the border on a regular basis. And,
but would a physical border bother you, basically? If it was a discrete physical border, would that bother you?
It wouldn't overly bother me personally, no, because a lot of what I produce is sold within the UK.
Yeah. Let's go to William, if I might, because you basically you're running a truck business at the moment.
No, I drive a truck.
You drive trucks. Yeah. And you voted leave.
Yep.
And how worried are you by the idea that the border may be souped up here, may become something... It's so insignificant at the moment.
It's all hype about a border. The border's not needed. It's...
Well, you might say we want to put we want to make
but
sure...
But that's okay. But even within the EU, every time you're going through another country, you're going through border checks everywhere, and people, you don't know it, but you're doing it. Dover to Kelly, you've got border checks at Dover, you've got border checks at Kelly. Going each direction on the train, you've got border checks. So what? They don't have to stop every vehicle. They can choose who they stop. They can maybe track, as I think Nelson said, they can track, and they do track at the minute, high-value goods, always for tax purposes, probably.
A Remain voice, haven't got it the right way around. Anya, because you're a businesswoman, you run a microbrewery. Yep. You don't live in Northern Ireland, you live in just on the boundary. You export a bit, don't you, of your beer over,
we do.
Over
Some of our beer goes to Northern Ireland, and as it stands at the moment, because it's excisable, we have to go through a distributor. We can't drive the 50 metres across the border from our brewery to a bar to sell our beer. We have to send it up to Belfast, where it goes through a wet bonded warehouse and comes back down here.
So, hang on, so that's a border that exists at the moment?
Yes,
a border
because we're selling an excisable product. But on the other hand, there isn't a border, because if I want to go to Dublin with my goods, I can drive straight through Northern Ireland
Oh, you can pop through back across the lines.
I can self-declare
to
that
get...
I'm not selling in Northern Ireland.
And you self-declare that you're not selling when you go?
Yes, but the problem is we're going to have a similar problem that they said about the land bridge. We are actually going to have a land barrier if a hard border goes in.
If you want to get over to the continent of Europe?
No, if we want to get to Dublin.
Oh, to
in
Dublin.
our own country, because the direct line from Donegal to Dublin goes through Northern Ireland. So if there's a hard border, it will effectively annex Donegal.
You have to drive further then to get round to the...
We'll have to drive via Sligo, go all the way down the west coast and across to Dublin.
Yeah, that doesn't sound great, Nelson, actually, does it? That sounds like quite a problem.
Well, that's why it's so important that we see an end to the current obstructionist views emanating from Dublin and Brussels. And that you actually have cooperation on these issues. The problem has been up to now very much that the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach in Dublin, Leo Varadkar, and Simon Coveney, his deputy, have had this attitude of, well, it's nothing to do with us, it's over to you, we're not going to help. And it's that attitude of...
That's not true.
Sorry,
It
is true.
But Martina,
that's what they have actually said.
Wait, sorry, another point from Martina.
That is not true.
Martina, we've actually heard there is a border. There's an excisable border.
The British,
Anya can't bring her stuff straight into the north.
The British government has made a commitment. Now, I think
that's the only that's the only argument you're going to give, is that the commitment's made, so we don't need any other...
going to give. But you know, it is an important one, and I don't know if in the British establishment that the definition of a commitment and obligation is something that is understood. But we warned the EU, can I tell you, when the joint report was agreed. I stood up in the European Parliament. I have been engaging with Michel Barnier, with Guy Verhofstadt and all of the negotiators, because no one knows the British better than us, and they don't honour commitments. Okay, and I think that was very clear. That was very clearly emanated. The ink was hardly dry.
The British have said there won't be a physical border. That has been said, so we'll see whether that is what happens. Vincent, tell us, because you voted Leave. You're actually quite well-known nationalist in this area, so you're, if you like, something of an outlier in the
Yes, well, I voted Leave because I do not want to be part of a 27-state super government.
But you, as a nationalist, must think any idea of a border is terrible, right? You must agree
there should
with
be
Martina
no borders in Ireland at all, neither British nor European. And I don't know why they're there, why we're even talking about it, or why we're even kowtowing to Europe. That's my honest opinion, because what I would like to see is the 32-county sovereign island of Ireland where the people could...
But in the meantime, a border, because that's what you voted for, if you voted Leave, you voted for there to be some differences between the United Kingdom and the Republic.
My understanding was Brexit means Brexit. Walk away, it's done.
And a border.
Any other agreements? Border was nowhere mentioned. It was just Brexit means walk. Okay. It's a done deal.
Catriona, you're 16. You go to school, but I know you're worried about it. You don't.
Yeah. Well, I'm very worried about it because, aside from most of the people here, I'm part of the minority who weren't able to vote, and it's going to affect us a lot more than I think it's going to affect people around me, especially in regards to if we have a border, we're taking a huge step backwards. I mean, everyone around me has had to see the troubles that I haven't got to see and the difficulties a border has caused. I don't understand why we would take that much of a step backwards and end up in that.
You will be able, you have an Irish passport, you can live in the north, you can get an an EU passport. So unlike people in Great Britain, you do actually keep all the rights, don't you? So that's a pretty good advantage, isn't it?
No, it's a great advantage, but even in the sense of, well, the movement of people and the movement of goods wouldn't affect me as much, and the ins and outs of Brexit wouldn't be something that the young people would really look into. It's more the effects of, as we grow up, are we going to end up in the same position as they were a couple of years ago?
Paulina, now you are a Polish woman who moved here. How long have you been here?
Well, I've lived here for 12 years now.
12 years.
Yes.
So and what passport are you on now?
I've got a Polish one and a British one as well.
So you can always get out. And you've got your escape.
Yes. But at the same time, I remember when Poland joined EU, and in the beginning we were not in the Schengen zone, so we had hard border with Germany. And I cannot imagine a situation like this here. Now imagine you're going, on holidays, but also think about goods, and you are stopped at the border for 7-8 hours. And every passport is checked. Some people are singled out in the middle of the night, 5 o'clock, in the morning, and you are told to unpack all your stuff, all your suitcases you've got, because the German customs want to see what you're carrying into Germany.
But that also still happens.
It's not going to happen.
No.
It's not going to happen on this island.
Definitely.
Well, it does happen within the EU.
No.
It does. It does. It happens in Calais. It happens in Dover.
We'll get back.
Every passport's checked.
We'll get back to the conversation. But I just want a quick show of hands of the 6 of you. If the choice was some small amount of physical infrastructure or a soft Brexit, which one would you choose? The soft Brexit, in which we're in the customs union, and which of you would choose the soft Brexit? And which of you would choose the hard Brexit with a bit of physical infrastructure?
Hard Brexit. I don't think it's a simple choice.
That's not a simple choice.
False choice. Okay. Well, look, we're going to talk a bit more. Thank you both very much indeed. You will notice we've not heard from the British government tonight. We did ask, but they clearly need more time to work out their view. But it is true that there's a cabinet committee meeting tomorrow. Some of that group of leading ministers have already been divided into study groups to look at 2 options for avoiding the big dilemma. Our political editor, Nick Watt, is in Westminster. And Nick, maybe just bring us up to date on what is going on there and the thinking inside the cabinet.
Yes, so that Brexit Cabinet Subcommittee does meet tomorrow to discuss this but not decide on the customs issue. As I understand it, it's going to take a few more weeks to resolve this issue. But Theresa May did invite all Conservative backbenchers for a series of briefings in Downing Street on the 2 options that are being looked at. I'm told that the meetings were very factual, they were very neutral, but there are strong hopes amongst Brexit Tories that they will eventually come down on the side of an amended version of this technological solution for the border, the supposed maximum facilitation idea. Now, Theresa May's problem with this so far has been that it was breached that commitment you've been talking about there, that she said there would be no physical infrastructure on that border. I am told now the language is that there should be no hard infrastructure. So that could be infrastructure, just not hard infrastructure. But look, this government is divided on Northern Ireland. I was talking to one cabinet minister who is furious with the way that Michel Barnier has been visiting both sides of the border, saying, does he want to be responsible for restarting the Troubles? But other voices in government are saying, you've got to get Brexit right, because if you get it wrong, you will inflame nationalist opinion and destabilise Northern Ireland.
Nick, thank you very much. Well, look, the Irish Republic has taken a consistent and clear position that there can be no physical infrastructure at all, with no wiggle room for interpretation on what that means. Joe McHugh is the Irish government's chief whip and a minister in the Department of the Taoiseach. And thank you very much for coming over tonight, Joe. So Nick is saying that the British government are thinking there may be some wiggle room on some physical objects, as long as you don't call them a hard physical border. And that's not acceptable to Ireland, as I understand it.
Well, our consistency has been that we don't want a hard border, and that will continue, and that's...
But that includes a discrete camera anywhere, or...
No cameras.
Yeah, yeah. Try and work out scenarios here. We have been told that it's not a done deal yet, and this issue could scupper the deal, and there could possibly be no deal, no Brexit deal. What happens to the Irish border if there's no deal?
Well, we're in the space where we're working towards June. That's the date. We're allowing the British government and the British Prime Minister and her team to come up with practical, workable solutions. In fairness to the Prime Minister, her bona fides are, since Christmas, she's committed to it, committed to legal text in March. So we're doing that on the backdrop to the whole thing, and the basis to our whole consistency is a Good Friday Agreement.
If there is no deal, I mean, I think it's quite possible the Brits would just say, well, we're going to do nothing. We're just going to let smuggling curb between the EU and the UK. What would the EU and what would the Republic do to that border on their side if there's no deal? Because you're the ones threatening no deal and saying, guys, there's going to be no deal if you don't sort it out. And I'm just wondering whether that's a credible threat.
No, we're not threatening anything. We've just been consistent. We didn't vote for Brexit. We respect the United Kingdom result in relation to what way it went, but we also respect the bona fides of the Irish people and Northern Irish people in relation to the democratic decision around the Good Friday Agreement. So we're protecting the peace, protecting a very, very fragile peace.
So no deal is not a threat. Let's talk about the backstop, because the backstop, as far as the European Union is concerned, is that essentially Northern Ireland should stay in a kind of customs union with the EU and align enough goods that there doesn't need to be a border for physical products crossing the border, correct?
Well, look, we've been consistent again in saying that we'd rather the United Kingdom stayed in the customs union and the single market.
That's the backstop.
That's the backstop.
And if the UK, because I just want to be 100% clear, if the UK said, well, we're not going to allow Northern Ireland to deviate from the rest of the UK, so we also will align on goods regulation and will also stay in the customs union, if, and that's not the government policy, if they did, that would be a solution to the Northern Ireland border problem, correct?
Well, the solution is, in order to protect the parameters of the Good Friday Agreement, that there's no obstruction on an east-west basis and north-south basis.
Right, yeah. And would there be free movement in that scenario? So would the British be able to say, we've got no border with Northern Ireland, we stay in a customs union, and we align our regulation on goods, services don't cross borders, it's easy. Would that be allowed with no free movement?
Well, that's going to be a matter of the negotiations between the European 27 and the United Kingdom government.
On what basis could they reject that as an option, given that it solves the Irish border problem, it's consistent with everything in the joint report that they agreed back in that turbulent December, that would be no free movement, we wouldn't be in the single market, so we shouldn't, because we'd only be aligning our goods regulation. They've already suggested it for Northern Ireland. All we'd be doing is extending Northern Ireland to the rest of the...
It's another option, it's another solution.
But is it on offer? I just want to make sure that it's on offer to us.
There's nothing on the table for us because it's between the European Union and the
Is
British
your understanding that the Europeans are offering it to us?
No, it's not my understanding that...
But on what grounds would they be refusing it, given that it seems to be what was implied in the joint report?
Well, once again, going back to our consistent position is there will be a negotiation between the United Kingdom and the European Union. They've decided to leave. We have to come up with a solution. And one of the things I would like to say in relation to the peace process, peace is not just the absence of violence. We have made massive progress in the last 20 years around telecommunications, transport, education, cross-border activity. So it's our duty and our obligation as custodians of the Good Friday Agreement that continues. Now, obviously, the United Kingdom have decided to leave. We respect that decision, that democratic decision, but equally we have a democratic outcome from the Good Friday Agreement, north and south, which the majority of the people wanted the north-south, east-west relationship to build, to grow, and it will.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Look, the one thing that hangs over the debate here, and we kind of touched on it, is the implied threat of renewed violence if anything happens to make the invisible border here now more obvious. Tomorrow on Newsnight, you're going to see a piece on that subject by the veteran documentary maker and Northern Ireland observer Peter Taylor. We're not going to give much away now, but among others, he did talk to the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, George Hamilton, and here's a taste of what he said.
I think the uncertainty around Brexit and the border, is a concern, certainly from a policing perspective. We wouldn't want to see anything that looks like physical infrastructure at the border, primarily because we assess that could symbolically become the focus of attention and targeting by violent dissident Republican groups.
Well, let's take a longer view on where Brexit fits into the arc of history on this island. Joining me now is the historian and commentator Ruth Dudley-Edwards and Shona Murray, who writes on Brexit for the Irish Independent. Evening to you both. First of all, Shona, how seriously should we take the threat that violence would emerge? Not just, it would be a sort of serious break with the peace of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, of course you have to take any sort of threat to peace serious. You couldn't turn around and say that there's no threat to it, but the whole point of signing an international peace agreement 20 years ago is to ensure that that doesn't happen anymore. I think that if your position is to be guided by whether or not paramilitaries decide to engage in violence again, then that's to be led by them. The priority now is to ensure that you protect the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement hasn't just protected people from violence, from the onslaught of violence. It's protected and evolved the relations between the two governments.
The Brexiteers might think you want the Good Friday Agreement to be a bit flexible, that it's not fixed in time so that Britain can't change its status ever more because it's signed up to
it should adapt. And we heard there are perfectly...
In what way would you change it to make it more
well,
flexible?
I mean, you know, you would allow some cameras, or you would say we can have this versions of Brexit that are compatible.
The point of to have no borders is to ensure that you don't go back to a situation which was problematic in the past. It's not just about borders either. The Good Friday Agreement and through membership of the European Union allowed for the self-determination of people who, living in Belfast, decided they're Irish and they have European passports. So it's a lot more than that.
Yeah. Ruth, first of the threat of violence, I mean, does it worry you that is that lurking around, and should that sway the decisions that the British are making?
No, I absolutely agree with Shona. You do not allow yourself to be led by paramilitaries. I mean, who exactly are going to be these paramilitaries? Are you suggesting that Sinn Féin will wake up the IRA and say, go back to work, lads? There are a few dissidents around who look for any opportunity to do bad things. And they do bad things from time to time, but they're actually, in fact, they don't approve of the EU, so they're in a rather peculiar logistical position. I mean, I'm sorry, Evan, but I think you're putting up Aunt Sally's all the time. There is no need for physical infrastructure to be put on the border. There is no need. I mean, my phone knows where I am at any time. It can tell you now what my whole history is today. Every heavy goods vehicle can have a tracking system. There is no need for a physical border. Nobody wants it. Everybody wants it.
In the customs union, of course, you're going to have some border checks. You're going to have two different jurisdictions. It's an impossible thing to say that you wouldn't have to have cameras or some borders. And even if you have something that represents 95% of checks, it's the 5% that's the issue. The problem is the narrative. The narrative is that people believe that, you know, for example, just some cameras and some physical infrastructure can maintain a minor border. The objective here is to have zero borders, is to not return to any borders of the past. It's to maintain the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement.
There is no borders with different customs unions where people just say, let's not worry about a border, because the point of the customs is to have a border.
But Evan, we have one at the moment. I mean, we have one because we've got two different currencies.
But that's
as
not
it stands,
border issue.
you've got people. You have buses being stopped when they go across the border, and people being taken off because they are considered to be perhaps unwelcome potential immigrants in the south. This happens all the time. There are certain things that happen on the border. It is still a border for certain purposes, but there is no reason for any physical infrastructure.
Let's just say that is not the view of trade experts who think if you're in different customs
No, that is not the view.
It's not the view of everybody who works in this area.
It is actually the view of most trade experts. It is the media are talking this up.
No, it's a World Trade Organization.
I don't think that. Anyway, we've discussed that a bit. Shona, is this a big moment for UK-Ireland relations? Has this really set things back when we look at the bigger historic picture?
Unfortunately, it's definitely a huge issue. The Good Friday Agreement brought with it an evolution of excellent peace talks and relations between the UK and Ireland, which has been absent pretty much for centuries. And so that's something that has been really welcomed on the island of Ireland. It also started with the Queen's visit in 2011, the Irish President's visit to the UK. And that has set it back because there appears to be a disregard by Brexiteers in particular, and in some ways the British government, for the impact that Brexit is going to have on Ireland.
Do you accept that, Ruth, that there's been a disregard for this?
I think it's fair to say that the UK didn't think about it that much, but it has to be said they are desperate not to have a hard border, and it has to be said that if Enda Kenny was still Taoiseach, there wouldn't be this problem. It was Leo Varadkar who got rid of the technical group who were looking at possible simple answers to the border.
It's nothing to do with Leo Varadkar. It's because the British have pushed it to this point 2 years since Brexit and still haven't come up with a decent solution.
There has been aggression.
We're already overrunning our time, I'm told. We're going to have to stop. I'm so sorry. Thank you to our panel. We will be following some of these things over this week. But this it's not the end of our coverage, because we'll be revisiting it throughout the week. You can see the full Peter Taylor piece tomorrow, and later in the week we'll be hearing from our technology editor David Grossman on what can be done to make a border invisible using only gadgets and gizmos. We've had some discussion, some disagreement in Derry tonight. It's now down to the British government to work out its position. And just to reiterate, that's actually not the decider. That's just the start of the actual proper negotiation with the EU. I'll be back tomorrow from London, but from Derry, good night. Now, Now, if you saw the programme yesterday, you'll know that all this week we're taking a close look at Brexit and the Irish border. The government is doing the same. In fact, not quite sure how to reconcile its vision of a clean break with the EU with that of having no material border at all between Northern Ireland and the Republic. We'll talk more about the politics of that shortly. But first, a fear that hangs over the debate is that of renewed sectarianism and violence. The Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland has told Newsnight that he wouldn't want anything that looks like physical infrastructure at the border, lest it could be targeted by violent dissident Republican groups. So how serious is the threat? Peter Taylor has this report exploring the new Republican dissident.
I've almost lost count of the number of Republican Easter commemorations I've filmed in Belfast over the years, marching up the Falls Road to Milltown Cemetery, where the IRA's dead lie buried. You would have thought that such semi-paramilitary displays have been consigned to history in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago. You would be wrong. This march is organised by a legal political party of dissident Republicans called CIRU, Irish for Liberation. Its supporters include prominent Republican dissidents like the Duffy brothers.
Brexit, in the context of Ireland, identified the failure to address the root cause of the conflict that exists between Britain and Ireland.
Which is?
Well, partition itself and the denial of Irish national sovereignty.
CIRU rejects the Good Friday Agreement and regards the IRA and Sinn Féin's decision to embrace constitutional politics at Stormont as the great betrayal.
This isn't really a paramilitary display, but it's pretty close to it. As you can see from the military uniforms, there are no balaclavas and no weapons, but the message is quite clear. For these people, or many of these people, the war isn't over. And the dissidents, have they got support?
No, they don't.
None at all?
They may have the ability to carry out individual actions, but, you know, all thinking Republicans are committed to peaceful and democratic means. The IRA is gone.
Some of the leaders of one of the largest dissident organisations are your former comrades. What would you say to them?
Go away.
I will respond back to Mr. Adams saying we've no intention of going home, Gerry.
The Chief Constable believes that the threat from the wider dissident movement is a real danger.
The threat that they pose is assessed as being severe. That is, that an attack is highly likely.
Severe?
Yes, but their capability is quite limited. We're confident, for example, that we disrupt or stop more attacks than they get to actually carry out.
The police and MI5 have monitored and infiltrated the movement, as they once did with the IRA and Sinn Féin. Republicans have always been adept at exploiting issues that fuel their cause. For CIRU and the dissidents, Brexit is manna from heaven.
Brexit has the potential to break up the British state, and as such it offers Irish Republicans an opportunity to realise our first great objective, the ending of the British occupation and the reunification of the Irish nation. And as history teaches us, it will inevitably stoke the fires of resistance against British rule in Ireland.
That resistance is now carried out by what CIRU's supporters call the IRA. That's different from the IRA that ended its military campaign in the mid-1990s. The police and MI5 now refer to the dissidents' armed wing as the new IRA.
The new IRA was formed in 2012. It was a loose network of people who were still trying to develop violent attacks. They have carried out in around 40 attacks in the 6 years since they've been in existence. A number of people in the leadership positions would have been people who previously had an association with the provisional IRA and couldn't bring themselves to support the peace process.
Just over 70 people have been murdered by dissident Republicans since the Good Friday Agreement. that was designed to bring an end to the violence. Prison officer David Black was shot dead on his way to work. Another prison officer died in a bomb attack. Dissidents have also murdered 2 police officers and shot dead 2 soldiers. Most of the dissidents' victims are from within their own community. Unlike the provisional IRA, the new IRA has limited weaponry. It's sufficient to wage a campaign, but not on the scale of the IRA's. After it called its ceasefire in 1994, the IRA decommissioned its huge arsenal, much of it from Libya, but not every weapon was destroyed.
We have seen it through forensic examination that some of the weaponry that we have seized off dissident Republicans would have had its origins in the stockpiles of the original PIRA. You've got some key figures, leadership figures who didn't buy the dream of the peace process, who moved across, created these violent dissident groups, may have had access to some weaponry that was still available to them.
During the years of the conflict, there were well over 200 border crossings, official and unofficial. The main ones with police and army fortified checkpoints. They became a sitting target for IRA attacks. At one checkpoint outside Londonderry, or Derry, a hostage, Patrick Gillespie, was used to deliver a proxy bomb. He died in the explosion, along with 5 soldiers.
I think the uncertainty around Brexit and the border, is a concern, certainly from a policing perspective. We wouldn't want to see anything that looks like physical infrastructure at the border, primarily because we assess that could symbolically become the focus of attention and targeting by violent dissident Republican groups.
At the height of the so-called Troubles, border areas around Republican strongholds like Crossmaglen were death traps for the police and army, with cross-border hit-and-run attacks by the IRA. The memories are still there. To dissident Republicans like Paul Duffy, the border remains at the heart of the conflict.
When we talk about a border, obviously you're talking about an artificially created border here by Britain, once Britain claimed its jurisdiction over the 6 counties.
The pertinent question is, what is the relationship between CERU and the so-called new IRA? Does CERU support the continuing use of violence?
If we're talking about resistance to partition and resistance to British occupation, well, that resistance exists today, that there are armed groups out there who are involved in actions against the occupying forces.
Do you support those actions by those armed groups?
The first thing I will say, and I want to make quite clear, is that I'm not a member of any armed group, not involved in any armed group. CERU, as a political party, are not involved in armed actions. I understand why those activities are carried out, and I understand why an organisation such as the Irish Republican Army exists and exists today.
But you can't say that you support it?
No, and legally it prohibits anybody from getting into an engagement in an argument or debate or offering an analysis around support for any of those groups.
But I assume that you do.
Well, you can assume away, Peter.
Looking at the CERU march with its semi-paramilitary trappings, you could be forgiven for raising an eyebrow over Paul Duffy's comments.
CERU is the political voice of the new IRA.
CERU say that they have no connection whatsoever.
It's not my assessment. I think there's significant overlap between the leadership of both the new IRA and CERU.
As there was with Sinn Fein and the IRA.
And it's just history repeating itself. It's the same old rhetoric where people are trying to justify terrorism but distance themselves from it. So it's not an assessment that I think has any credibility. They are pretty much one and the same.
And your assessment of the leadership of CERU and the new IRA?
Not quite one and the same, but significant overlap between the leadership of the 2 components. So there are a number of people who are very senior in the new IRA who are also senior in the leadership of CERU, would be our assessment.
CERU denies the connection made by the Chief Constable.
Don't be fooled by votes. Don't be fooled by talk of border polls and referenda. The Irish people have not had democracy since the 1918 general election. British imperialism since that date has ruled Ireland on an alternating basis of military force or coercion. The only fly in the ointment is the looming storm that is Brexit.
Although all parties to the Brexit negotiations are agreed on the need to avoid a hard border with customs controls and checks, as yet there is no agreement on how that may be achieved. But there is agreement on the dangers and the risk to peace that was established by the Good Friday Agreement. Its 20th anniversary was celebrated in Belfast last month. Senator George Mitchell was its architect, wringing major concessions out of all the parties involved in the negotiations. Senator, does Brexit threaten the Good Friday Agreement?
Yes, it does, if not done the right way.
Why must there not be, in your view, a hard border?
Brexit was a decision democratically taken in a democratic society and therefore must be respected. I believe history will judge this to have been an unwise decision for the UK and its people, but in particular for the Republic of Ireland if there is a hard border. And I think a hard border will be devastating for the people of Ireland who didn't vote for it, who don't support it.
The determination to see the unfinished revolution through to a successful conclusion burns stronger than ever. Comrades, go from here today and advance the struggle for freedom.
Sinn Fein would argue that they too are struggling for freedom, but in a constitutional way.
In terms of them having the capacity, the ability, the strategy, and most particularly the support. There is no support within the broad Republican section for any return to conflict.
Those who are prepared to use violence to achieve their political objectives will seize on any opportunity to use violence to advance their interests and try to stir up a return to sectarian conflict. I don't think that they will gain any significant support in this society or in the Republic. But the possibility remains that they may try, and it is that against which we should guard.
The dissidents' prediction that Brexit, England's difficulty, will be Ireland's opportunity, is likely to be a fond hope. A hard border is unlikely. Nevertheless, dissidents will probably be undaunted. As Gerry Adams once said of the IRA, they haven't gone away, you know. With regards to the new IRA, the dissidents could say the same.
Peter Taylor reporting. Well, the Customs Union has been at the heart of a government division on Brexit and the border. And today, the Cabinet Brexit Committee agreed there'd be a white paper on the issue in the next few weeks, which is strange because we had a white paper 15 months ago, but a lot of water, I suppose, has passed under the bridge since then. Nick Watt is with me now. Nick, interesting to hear what the Chief Constable was saying there. Quite clear, does not really want any physical border because it just becomes a target.
No physical infrastructure, the exact wording that the Prime Minister used in her Mansion House speech in March, but interestingly not the language she used in a Sunday Times article at the weekend when she talked about how there should be no hard border. And I was reporting yesterday that the language I'd heard is that there should be no hard infrastructure. Now, there is a feeling in Whitehall that the Prime Minister...
but not hard
exactly, that there is a slight sort of change in the language that the Prime Minister is using, and I'm told that this is the Prime Minister reaching out to Brexiteers and saying, you know, I'm hearing your concerns. But fundamentally on Northern Ireland, the Prime Minister, I'm told, does believe that this is an acutely sensitive issue that must be got right. And ministers have been told in no uncertain terms that if Brexit goes wrong, then you could imperil the future of the United Kingdom, because ministers have been told that that could sort of get it wrong and you could increase support for nationalism, the nationalist side in Northern Ireland. And in those circumstances, the Northern Ireland Secretary would have to, under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, call a poll, a referendum on Northern Ireland's future.
Yeah. Should just ask you about Windrush. We had a new admission today, a kind of follow-up one, Sajid Javid, new Home Secretary, on deportation.
That's right, saying that 63 members of the Windrush generation could have been wrongly deported, to which you say, well, how did that not happen under Amber Rudd when she said she didn't think any had been wrongly deported? What happened is Sajid Javid took over, has been asking some big questions. 8,000 cases been examined, and it's basically anyone born before 1973. They're saying they could have fallen into this category. Now, it's 32 are foreign national offenders, 31 are administrative removals. That's people who were in forced returns. And the view in the Home Office is that the latter group, the government is going to make a huge effort to reach out to those, and if they want to come back, they should be encouraged to come back. The government will be doing nothing for the foreign national offenders, but if they apply, they may well have the right to come back.
OK, Nick, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now by Damien Green, Theresa May's oldest political ally, former First Secretary of State in her government, and actually an immigration minister some time back, so maybe we'll talk a little about Windrush later, but I do want to get back to the whole border issue, Damien. So the British did say that Theresa May said no physical infrastructure. Are they going to stick to that? Is that still your understanding? There will be no physical infrastructure? Because it sounds like there's a sort of bit of wordplay going on.
Yeah, I think it's possible to overanalyse the words, but yet there is no desire to have...
No desire. There will be none.
Well, all right, yes. Well, if the government doesn't desire to do it, then it won't put it there. Because... for all the reasons you thought, that was a quite chilling film. I think that's a tiny sliver of Northern Ireland society. But nevertheless, there is a genuine fear that people who in the last border poll, Catholics in the last border poll who voted to stay in the UK, we want them to keep doing that. You know, this is a Conservative and Unionist government.
Right. Because Theresa May actually has been sort of warning the Brexiteers, look, guys, if you push this too hard, we'll get a border poll and we may lose Northern Ireland. So are you saying that isn't a bluff? Because I think a lot of the Brexiteers have just thought this is a silly attempt to sort of pull them into making concessions.
No, I think that's not a bluff. It's absolutely not a bluff. But almost equally important is the practicality of it. I think a lot of this border dispute, whether it's Ireland or other parts of the UK, you have to look at the practicalities. We now know there are more roads that cross the Irish border than there are between the eastern border of the European Union and every other country on that eastern border. The idea that you can have a traditional border there, it would not only be politically disastrous, it's a nonsense in practical terms.
If that turned out to be, if by some set of circumstances the government agreed on something that put in physical infrastructure, that was the assumption, it was some technological wheeze, but you needed number plate readers, would you vote to stay in a customs union and just say we can't have that?
Well, I mean, the government has said it's not going to do that, so that hypothesis just doesn't obtain. And you've heard the Chief Constable saying that he would be very against that, and I understand the Guardian the same. Could you vote to stay in a customs
union in any other circumstance?
Well, no, I mean, I fought a general election on a manifesto that said we were leaving the customs union. What the current debate is about is finding a practical way of doing that. What I think is in a sense frustrating about the current debate is that people faced with maximum facilitation or a new customs partnership appear to be getting ideological about it. I think we just need to be practical about this. You know, both of these ways of doing it have their advantages and disadvantages. You can mix and match to some extent, but what I really care about is allowing trade to flow freely, and not just in terms of national prosperity, though that's hugely important. We talked about the Irish border. Think about Dover-Calais. If that border goes wrong, then I feel this very personally as an MP in Kent, because Kent will gum up. We cannot have that happen.
But you're telling the Brexiteers, look, guys, just compromise more. And they feel Brexit is on the line here. It's not going to be a proper Brexit if some of the plans talked about getting...
I'm not just telling the Brexiteers to compromise more, I'm telling everyone to compromise more. I'm telling everyone to be practical, to stop getting in ideological camps and say what we all want is for Britain's trade to flow as freely as possible. Now, we're not yet sure how best to achieve that, and then we have to negotiate it with the European Union, but that's what matters.
What do you make of the whole way government is being conducted at the moment? Boris Johnson calling One Idea crazy. I mean, it's a pretty strange time, isn't it? The European Research Group, this group of a few tens of Tory MPs, WhatsApping each other. They're talking about Theresa May being weak and such like. Maybe there'll be a lot of gossip this weekend, one of them is reported to be saying. What?
Well, I mean, Brexit is obviously, in a sense, has changed the terms of trade of politics. But nevertheless, I think some certainties should remain, one of which, as others have said, is that cabinet ministers should have their disputes in private and shouldn't do it in public. That's just a way of running a government properly. So that should certainly happen. And groups of MPs throughout history have got together and have said, we all think really strongly about this, so we're going to discuss and if right. plot and all that kind of thing. So none of this is new. There's WhatsApp now. There wasn't 10 years ago, but that doesn't change the underlying point.
If by some set of circumstances Boris became leader, basically, Brexit the Commons the Tory rebels would erupt, wouldn't they? They'd just basically feel liberated and say, hey, we don't need to be loyal anymore. We can just vote with our consciences. All of you would, wouldn't you?
Well, you can enjoy hypothetical speculation. I'm not going to join you down that because I think it is very, very important that we reach a practical settlement on customs and on everything else. You talk about that white paper. That's going to cover the whole range of issues. And there's a narrow landing strip, but there is a landing strip there where we will Brexit. And having a practical Brexit is actually, even someone like me, I was a Remainer at the referendum, but I think it's really important to get the best Brexit.
Just a couple of sentences on Windrush. I mean, the Home Office seems to be more kind of changing more than maybe we'd realised when Sajid Javid came in, with, changing its standard or its definition of what was a faulty deportation. And maybe we're just in for a completely new era now at the Home Office. Do you think?
I think it's genuinely too early to say. I mean, clearly, not just since Sajid took over, when Amber was there as well, they were investigating these cases, which I think the Home Office institutionally didn't seem to know about until it did this kind of deep dive into them. And obviously, the individual cases need to be sorted out.
Damien Green, thanks very much.
Thank you.